maps and timelines? Well, everyone, especially students, they love making maps. They love timelines. These are such crucial skills to spatio temporal literacy. Geography are great ways to also help students build their digital literacy skills. Maps and timelines really help students make these important connections between space and time and history, literature, and other humanities areas. And there are lots of freely available resources, both for maps and timelines and tools. And so we'll talk through some of them today, and we have more links on these slides than we can go into. And so they're just resources for you for later. So I'm going to start with things that you can do just as a teacher with a projector without needing devices for your students. And I wanted to just pull out a sampling of the kind of teaks that you can address with mapping and timeline projects. So these are English language art standards thinking about author's purpose and craft. So analyzing a map, analyzing a timeline as a text that you can then think about what kinds of choices is the author making, what kind of audience is the author trying to reach, what kind of images has the author used in the blend of image and text, and so what does that tell us about how to communicate and how to produce effects with an audience. So that's sort of the interpretation and analysis. As we know, we talked about yesterday, primary sources are really, really crucial, particularly in teaks. And so this is a great way to engage with maps as primary sources, and also even to draw on some of the primary sources that we were talking about yesterday in terms of some of the archives that you have access to, and bringing them into mapping and into the making of timelines so that students are, for example, creating a timeline based on primary source documents. So that's an approach. And so, also sort of in terms of social studies, the opportunity of collecting visual images and media to enhance understanding and appreciation of multiple perspectives. So this is another place where the digital mapping, digital timelines can really come into play. And then finally, this is just one content example of social studies content. This is 1750, 1914, scientific revolution, imperialism, and so forth. As you'll see in so many of the resources that I'm going to demo, there are the gear materials for pretty much all of the topics in history and social studies in the teaks. So there's lots of opportunities for incorporating maps and timelines. Okay, so this is sort of an activity that I always use to start when I'm working with maps with my students and talking to my own teacher licensure candidates about, how do you bring in mapping into the classroom, whether as, a kind of text that we can interpret and analyze in an ELA context, or interpret and analyze in the context of history. So I really talk with them about how, their perceptions of maps, and they often think that maps are these objective representations, these neutral representations of space, that they're scientific, that they actually correspond to the sizes of land masses. They don't have a lot of understanding of sort of the Mercator projection and the distortions that the Mercator projection produces in our sense of the relative size of continents or even countries. And so this is sort of always where I start with them. And then I show them a clip, and I won't show this to you today in the interest of time, but you have the link there. From the West Wing, which, even though it sounds like a super dated reference, and it is for them, it's actually a really, really entertaining clip where the Society for Concerned Cartographers comes to the White House and tries to make the case for changing the map from, and Anthony's used this clip as well, changing the map from the Mercator projection to the Peters projection, which is going to actually be more reflective of the location and size of continents and countries. And it's just really funny because you see the people from the White House being like, what do you mean what do you mean Iceland isn't that big? And what do you mean Germany isn't where you think it is? And so it helps students understand the constructedness of maps and that they are representations of space. And that as representations, there are things to analyze and understand. And then what I also like to do is I like to show students some of the kinds of maps that they can analyze. So there have been a lot of maps. There's a weird amount of maps that involve octopi of all things. And and they're often about empire. And sometimes they're Cold War maps. Sometimes they're British imperialism maps. And so I'm laughing so hard. Anthony's quoting the West Wing clip in the chat. So it's always really interesting to have students think about a very different kind of map. And it's sort of very clear that a map that you're looking at here is essentially a propaganda map. But in a sense, all maps are propaganda. It's just that some we're very clearly recognized as being propaganda and some that are not, right? And so using these maps, as text that students can analyze, whether to, understand, well, in this case, the relationship between capitalism, poverty, and wage slavery, or to think about, what it means to use these images to represent a particular period of time in history is often very exciting to them. I also use this one because this is a colonial map that's really, really obvious. So when you look at it, it's Walter Crane's map of the British Empire, and I tend to have students think about not just sort of what they're seeing on the map in terms of the land masses, but also look at these depictions on the side and analyze them and analyze kind of what does it mean. You have this sort of Britannia figure sitting on the world in the middle, and you have these like racist depictions of indigenous people. And so though that really helps students with those ideas. Esri Geo Inquiries is a really wonderful site to play around with because they've created standards-based lessons based often on primary source documents that have a geographical angle to them. So you don't need to actually have students on a device to walk through this with students and show it to them. So this is Dr. King's Road to a Birmingham jail. So there are maps that could accompany your reading of a letter from a Birmingham jail. And the Geo Inquiries lessons come in all kinds of disciplines. And so, there are maps for American literature. And so there's everything from sort of 15-minute activities to longer lessons as well. Although these 15-minute activities, level 1, appear to be for American Lit. But when you go into history, history has also these sort of level 2s, which are full-length lesson plans that you can incorporate as well. And they're on all kinds of topics that are super relevant. And so what you get is a lesson plan. You get a link to the actual map. You can have the lesson plan for your reference. You can project the map to your students and lead them through the Geo Inquiry. It's such a great resource. I mean, I was saying actually after the event yesterday, it was so nice to see so many teachers here because before the pandemic, when I was teaching my Teaching with Technology course, my students were always sort of grumpy about it because they didn't really feel like they needed technology to teach. And then the pandemic happened, and then suddenly they were interested in teaching with technology. And so it was super exciting to see so many people here coming to get some more resources to use. So that's an example from Geo Inquiries. Story Maps. So Story Maps is a platform that you can also use with your students. And I will go into that one when we get into the section of actually, creating maps and creating timelines with our students. Story Maps is free. It's relatively easy to use. They have some templates that I'll show you later that make it super easy to make a story map, but it's essentially a blend of map, image, and text. So you could do a research project with students. And in this case, this is actually a lesson plan that a teacher has, designed in story maps. And so this is about exploring the Texas cattle trails. This is more for sort of elementary to middle school. But there are, they've incorporated images or asking students to analyze the images, to look at locations, to interact with the maps, to talk about the landscape. So this is a really exciting one. And so, one of the things you could consider doing actually is making your own sort of story map driven lesson for a class as a way to engage students in these elements. And story maps does have, this is their digital humanities gallery. So there are a lot of other story maps. They're not all created as a kind of directly as a lesson, but they can be really useful. So if you happen to be an ELA teacher and you're teaching the Aeneid, there's a story map project for it that you can use with your students, and they can explore the geographical angle of it. And then, there are other ones for other historical events and themes. And so it's a really cool resource. And I'll show you how to actually how easy it is to make one in a few minutes. So this is exploring Borderlands. It's a standards-based interactive with a timeline that comes from PBS Learning. And so, yes, that is mine. So it's a really exciting project in the sense that it sort of uses an interactive timeline to explore, in this case, the borders in the US, how they were created. It's a really exciting resource for students to play with, just even to just show them. And Ryan's saying there are lots of applications for this, and I'm so excited to hear your ideas and also to hear about what comes out of your groups, because I'd love to hear kind of what you're seeing and what you're thinking about when you're looking at these tools. PBS is lovely in the sense that PBS Learning Media has a ton of available materials to use. Even if they're not full lessons, often they have teaching tips associated with them. So it's a super useful resource to just kind of, when I work with students, for example, in history, who are creating a lesson plan in which, they're taking history methods and they're taking my technology methods course. And we're thinking about, okay, you have this history standard that you've selected that you want to work on, what kind of resources can we find to augment the student's experience this also really helps in terms of universal design for learning and meeting the needs of students who are English language learners or multilingual learners, and also students with disabilities, because when we're giving them multiple means of expression, multiple ways to take in knowledge, not just always sort of read the textbook, but also, here's this map, here's this video, it can help with understanding. Now, this project is actually a student-created timeline of US imperialism using a tool called Timeline.js. And I will show you how easy this is to use if you want to make timelines with your students. This was made in a college class by a professor. And it's actually just these timelines that are out there are really useful on their own as, almost supplemental to your textbook in terms of the content, the images. There's actually the timeline piece is down here. It's not showing up on the screen right now, but it looks at sort of these different moments. Now, this is particularly in US history, sort of looking at the angle of kind of colonialism and imperialism in the US. And what's really exciting about it is also not just about oppression, it's also about resistance. And so, you see both sort of ways, for example, that Native people have resisted colonization by the US government, as well as sort of ways that we've seen Latinx people, Native people getting into politics and using the entry into politics as a way of resistance. So not just sort of resistance in terms of what we often think of as resistance, but also sort of finding their voice through democratic processes as also a form of resistance. So it's itself a really useful tool. And in the website, Timeline.js website has a few other examples as well. And you'll see some of these also. Yesterday, Amy showed you the link for reviews in digital humanities. And so there are a number of timeline projects in there as well that can be just used as resources for your teaching. This is a timeline of US presidents created in Tiki-Taki. Now, Tiki-Taki they have a Tiki-Taki for education version. It's very limited in terms of what it can do, but other people have created timelines that can be useful in terms of your teaching. So this is a really great one for American history, for US history, for example. I've used Tiki-Taki with students. They really like it because it's very pretty, but it's sort of, they are one of those, a lot of these companies will sort of change every now and then and decide, oh, we're going to charge money for this, or, there's a limited free, it's not TikTok, don't worry. I would love to know what TikTok is. I mean, I know what TikTok is, but I feel like I'm too old for TikTok. So it's Tiki-Taki. Although, let us not, this isn't sort of this workshop, but in another workshop, we could talk about, social media as well as something that's useful. I've done that with students and done workshops on that too. Okay, so those are sort of things you can do without students having devices. Now I just want to go through a couple of resources that are really interesting if you do have access to student devices. All of these are free. And they're generally easy to use. It just takes a little bit of time on your behalf, playing around and experimenting with how you would design an assignment and get your own comfort and familiarity with the platform in order to, help your students out with that. And so in terms of the TEKS, I really think that these kinds of multimodal, multimedia composition experiences where you're not asking students to write an essay, but you're asking students to make a timeline, or you're asking students to create a map, is engaging these really important compositional skills. Because as we sort of were talking about in the last section of my presentation, maps are representations, timelines are representations, and we can analyze them and think about the choices that creators are making. And by putting students in the role as creators, they have an opportunity to think about what kind of arguments are they going to make through these forms of media that are not just an essay. And this is also a really wonderful opportunity for collaboration. If you have, if you're sometimes, some of our schools, we have we have humanities teams. And so there's more collaboration between ELA and history teachers. This is a really, using these maps and timelines are a really good opportunity for that, but they can totally be used in individual courses without a collaboration. Also, in order to really make a map, to make a timeline, we're really also asking students to do some kind of research, to look at primary sources, to look at secondary sources, to think about how they're going to synthesize them in the output of a map that they're creating or a timeline. And so all of those research skills, coming up with a research question, learning how to do it, iterative thinking, as everything doesn't really pan out with your research question, you kind of adapt and adjust and revise, and then thinking about the kinds of sources, how to cite, how to put it all together into a text that's going to communicate effectively with the audience you want to communicate with. These are all the kinds of skills that we engage when we ask the students to think about mapping and about timelines. Now, this is actually, before we get into actually looking at using the platforms, this is a site for map-based inquiry assignments, where there's essentially, it's almost sort of like scavenger hunts essentially for students. I'll show you. This is one on African imperialism and map analysis. And so there's a Google Doc, and in the Google Doc, there are these sort of questions for students to consider as they look at an interactive map. And so this is the map. And that's super useful because it's a way for students to kind of think about how are they finding information online, what kinds of reading skills are they using. And the nice thing about this mapping history site is also that there are so many different kinds of historical mapping sources that you can use, that you can look at for the various topics that you are working on with your students, and they all incorporate maps, and they can play with those. Okay, so in terms of mapping, the absolute most easy way to make a map with your students is actually just to use Google My Maps. What you see here is an example of a pin from a Google My Map that I've created with students. I'm looking at Black British literature and the locations, the settings of the books. And so what you can do, and I'll show you how in a second, is drop a pin. The slides should be in the Google Classroom if you want to access them. What you can do is drop a pin. You can add images, you can add text. And so students can do research on a location. Maybe it's a location of historical events, that happened, in turn of the century Texas, or maybe it's a literature class and you're looking at, locations where Odysseus traveled in the Odyssey. The students can each make a pin, or they can work in groups and make a pin and really illustrate the geographical dimensions of the history or of the text. And so the link for that is mymaps.google.com. And what you essentially go to is a dashboard where you can just click on create a new map. Now, if the advanced version of this is actually, you can have students put map locations in a spreadsheet and actually just upload that data to the Google map. That's slightly more complicated because you need latitude and longitude. But the easiest, most simple way to do this is actually just click on add marker, go to a location, drop a pin, and then you can, add the name of the location, some text about the location. You can add an image by URL. So if there's an image online, you can just drop in the link to the image, upload a photo, even embed a video from YouTube. So let's see what we can find. It's probably going to give me Whitney Houston, isn't it? If I search Houston, but okay, Houston. Here we go. We'll just go with this one. And then it just embeds the video for you in the map pin. And so, if you have a student doing research on a location, creating their pin, putting together the material, and then creating their pin, and you have everybody doing one, you can end up with a good number of places on a map, and then can sort of use that map to think through what the mapped dimension of these locations tells us, and how it informs our interpretation and our analysis, whether of historical events or of a text. These can also, what you can do is click on share. So you can share it as well. And so it can be disseminated. You can embed it on a website. You can do all kinds of things with it. So it's actually a very fun way to work with students that doesn't have it. And then we have a great example from Hallie saying, have them create a map for Native American cultural regions for Texas history. That's an amazing idea. There's also a link in the resources that come at the end of these slides to creating a community map in Google Maps, which is another idea that sort of actually goes to Amy's point about having students out of their hometown and a historical cultural location from their hometown. Okay, story maps. So before Texas Cattle, the Texas Cattle site with the lessons on it, that was story maps. And you can sort of explore all kinds of story maps in the galleries that they have available to you before you get started. And so there's all different kinds of maps. These are sort of for the professionally made maps, but you can see there's tons of them. So this is ArcGIS Story Maps. It's free, which is great. All you have to do is sign up for an account. You can have your students sign up for an account. You can have students create an individual story map. You can have them work together on different pieces of one story map. That's typically what I do and encourage with students, because it can be sort of, unless it's a capstone kind of project, it can be really overwhelming to make a whole thing by themselves. But for groups, it works really well. In order to create a story, you just have to click on this new story button. And what's really exciting is, if you want to, create the whole structure from scratch, you can. But if you don't want to, they have templates that you can use. So this is a guided map tour. So this would be if you want to have students map, let's say we're going to use the voyages of Columbus. If you want to have students mapping the voyages of Columbus and go through the different locations where he went over time, you could do that. So all you have to do is you type in a title for your story. And then the template is already built up for you here to just click add an image or video, either by uploading or linking from the internet, and to create text for your location. So it's actually really, really easy to use. And they have a couple other templates. They have the sidebar one, which looks like this. So this is where you can have the students sort of writing a story or telling a narrative on the left-hand side, and then they can add alongside that text an image or a map in order to, write about a specific place. And then the other, can this be out of the Google Docs? So the students will have to have a free account and log in if you're having them work individually on them. You can put the link to it to Google Docs so students can advertise. This is not a Google product, and so it won't be part of the Google suite. And then there's the Explorer view. And so, with the Explorer view is just another way to take people on a geographical tour. So you can add a point, you can add a location, you can upload images, and then it will display the location on the map. And then you can add another one, and it gives information about the map. And when you're done, you just click publish. It can be private, it can be public, publicly available. So that's story maps. And it's really, really fun to use. It's just not as easy as Google Maps, where it's just drop a pin, but it's not that hard though. Just takes some time to play around with it. The timeline tool that I recommend is called Timeline JS, which was created by the Knight Lab. And it's essentially just having students entering, dates and times, just usually dates, text, a headline, an image, and a description into a Google Sheet, and then clicking a couple buttons. I'll show you how easy it is in a second. Clicking a couple of buttons, and boom, it makes you a timeline. And so this is a screenshot from a timeline done by one of my students. in which the student did archival research on the founding of our university, which was a normal school. It was a teacher's college. And so she has an image from the first building. She has her year, headline, the text that she's written, and it all gets rendered into a timeline. And so this is their website. They have really lovely examples because their tool has been used by professional outlets like CNN and Time, because you can really tweak it and make it super pretty if you want. But it's also very, very simple. So their make a timeline button, you just click and you go to their Google spreadsheet template and you make a copy. So you could probably put, just the copy in your Google Classroom. And so students can work on it right from there. I'm just going to go with the example entries in the timeline here in the interests of time. But you have the students who put in the time, the date, put in the headline, put in the text they want to appear. They can link to the media that they want to appear, whether it's on Flickr, Google, Google Images. You can find them on other websites, stock photos. And then all you have to do to make this into a really, really cool timeline is you go to File, and they have their instructions on their website too. To File, and you go to Share, you say Publish to the web, and you publish this spreadsheet. And then you take the link from your browser, you go back to their website, you paste it here. And you can change the size if you want, the size of the timeline. And then it generates a link to your timeline. So I'm just going to show you what we did. There we go. We made a timeline. It's really simple, really easy to use for students. And this is another example where, this could be a group assignment. You could have students working on a couple different events that they're researching, and by putting together all the pieces the students are doing individually, you get a fleshed out and really exciting timeline. So then we just have some slides, and I won't really go through these of different, these are, a lot of them are sort of map collections that might be useful. I did pull out the digital map collection of the American Geographical Society because it's really, really robust and really useful. And then there are some other great resources. So National Geographic, they have some mapping resources that for a map maker interactive that students can create world maps as well. What else is up here? It's just some different activities. Oh, this is create a community map with the Google Maps. So customize a map that creates important locations in your community. So this is from Google for Education and sort of walks through how you would do that. I've included a couple assignments so you can see how other teachers have structured an assignment with story maps or structured an assignment with Timeline.js. Some real nuts and bolts. How do you actually do this as well?